Well, welcome everybody to our last session for today, a session that will build on the conversations that have been had already today, focusing on design and technology strategies to advance community-centered justice. I'm really delighted to introduce my colleague, Katie Lamb, Pro Bono Net's Legal Empowerment and Technology Fellow, and Eric Vang, an attorney and technology strategist from Alaska Legal Services Corporation, who are going to lead this session today. What I'll just say about this is I think everybody here, I think, will appreciate the perspectives that Eric and Katie are bringing to this topic today, which include thinking about both tactics and strategies to do co-design, whether you're co-located with communities and sitting face-to-face, or like us today when that's not possible because of the pandemic or because of geography or other issues. And Katie and Eric also have thought deeply about how to adapt these kinds of tools to both kind of high-tech or regular tech settings as well as low-tech settings. So I'm really looking forward to their perspectives today and the discussion. So because this will be a little bit more interactive than some of our other sessions, we'll let Katie and Eric take it from here, but please do, if you have questions or are having difficulty seeing or engaging with anything, don't hesitate to use the Q&A box and the chat. So with that, I'll turn it over to Katie.
Perfect. Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's session. And welcome to Tools and Tactics for Participatory Design. Like Liz mentioned, my name is Katie, and I am the Legal Empowerment and Technology Fellow at Pro Bono Net. Co-hosting today's workshop with me is Eric Vang. We'll be introducing ourselves a little bit more in a moment. Eric waves hi. A quick rundown of the agenda for today. I'm going to kick us off with a little bit on introductions and then move into a few slides talking about what co-design is on a very high level, why co-design can be a meaningful way to engage with communities, and then some recommendations from Eric and myself about implementing co-design, especially if you're coming from a non-technology or a non-human-centered design thinking type of environment, like a nonprofit or maybe an agency, really any space where you don't really work with this kind of framework. We're also going to try out at least one activity. There are double the number of people on this call than I had thought there might be, which is very exciting, but it did mean I had to scale down the degree of interactivity. That was a reflection of my bandwidth, not that those two can't happen at the same time. But anyway, we'll all enjoy this ride together. And then I'll close us out. I'll jump into introductions really quick. Like I said, my name is Katie. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm a fellow at Pro Bono Net, and my background is a combination of UX research, community-centered design, and increasingly product management. Eric, do you want to intro yourself?
Sure. My name is Eric Vang. I'm a attorney. I'm currently a senior technology attorney, which means that instead of just doing attorney stuff, I'm trying to find ways to expand the way that we both use technology internally and the way that we have our outward-facing materials or supports for folks, which is the project most relevant to what we're talking about today. So thanks for being here, everybody.
Very cool. I almost said my own name. Eric and I met each other through the Legal Empowerment and Technology Initiative, which I will talk more in a second. But we have applied a range of co-design methods for this project, and I'm excited to share what we learned. Before we start, so originally I had emailed this link out to folks, to a smaller group of folks who may or may not be on this call. But now that we've expanded, I thought either you, Eric, or you, Jenny, could you help me out by grabbing the Google Deck link or the Google Slide link and popping it into the chat?
Eric, do you have it handy? I can also pull it up.
Yeah, I got it here.
Awesome, thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Cool.
How's that?
Beautiful. I would invite everyone to open the slides. The slides have been available to or meant to be available to all of you, and you're welcome to poke around. Just please don't move it too many things. But I'm going to bring us over to slide number 5, where you have the option to copy and paste this really, now that I look at it more closely, kind of creepy looking smiley face, and move it on to the state where you are calling from. I see that some folks have already started moving smiley faces before the call even began, which is really exciting. I'm also sad to see Puerto Rico is not on this, so my bad to David. But yes, I would welcome folks to click on the slide deck that Eric had put in the chat, and then take a minute or two to copy and paste the smiley in the top right and move it onto the state that you're calling from.
We have a draw function. We could at least draw Puerto Rico on there.
That's a good, that is a good idea. I am not confident in my drawing skills. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent.
At least not like with a mouse, really not ideal. Oh,
excellent.
Douglas,
well
thank you for letting me know. I should have been thinking bigger, and I should have put a much larger map. Clearly my map was not inclusive enough. So thank you for the call out to Finland. Okay, I'm actually gonna minimize this for a moment, because I want to see where folks are coming from. Oh, very exciting. Great. Thank you, David, for this. I'm assuming that's David. Wow, very fun. Love this giant friend on the right-hand side over here. Very cool. All right, I'll give it another minute so folks can share where they're coming from. Very cool. I feel like I'm notoriously bad at reading maps. So there is a danger in me trying to name all the states that folks are coming from, because there really is a chance I wouldn't be able to. And again, that is not a reflection of anyone else except itself. Oh, thanks, Liz. Minnesota, very cool. Oh, David, I'm sorry. If you still haven't added, oh, thanks, Liz. The link to the slides should be in the chat if anyone else still needs it. Fun. Nice. Okay. I'm going to keep pushing forward, but go ahead and keep adding your smileys to the slide in the meantime. This is a living document, right? So folks are always welcome to come back to it. Before we dive into things, I did want to take a moment to review the learning objectives for today's session. They have changed a little bit since we have a larger audience, but I'm excited to share them nonetheless. There are really 3 for me, and Eric, I'll give you a moment to share any that you want to add. But the first one is I was hoping this session would be an opportunity for folks to expose folks to a new way of thinking about how we imagine legal aid and technology projects, specifically from the technology perspective. Like, how do we design a tool? And I frame it that way because I'm not sure exactly what everyone's backgrounds are necessarily. Certainly some of the ideas that Eric and I will talk about today can be applied to really any context you're coming from. You'll just need to adapt it to your own needs. But those two contexts are where Eric and I will be speaking from. And like I mentioned before, the initiative that Eric and I have been collaborating on involves both legal empowerment as an idea and also technology. And I just wanted to call out that today's session is really going to focus on the technology side of that work, a little bit less on the legal empowerment. The second learning objective is I do want to share, and Eric will share as well, really more practical ideas for virtual community engagement that ideally you can scale to help make decision-making more participatory, whatever that might look like for your context. So I'll be sharing a couple of exercises, including the one that we just did together before, that is small and can be used for something as lightweight and bonding type of exercise that is meant to be like an icebreaker, something that's kind of smaller scale. And then I'll also be sharing ways that you can layer these types of engagements or exercises in a way that makes an entire process ideally increasingly more participatory. So there will be a spectrum of type of engagement we'll be talking about today. And then the third learning objective I wanted to share was, I hope folks walk away from this session thinking a lot about who defines what change looks like in your environment or in the community that you're working in. In our case, we fundamentally believe that the community members most impacted by some kind of problem, whether that's a legal problem or a social problem, those community members should be able to define that change. They should be able to identify what they think the problem is and then be a part of the solution, really lead the solutioning of that process. So I would encourage, if you don't get anything else from this session, I would hope that this third question of who is defining change in this process, who is defining what the solution looks like or what the problem really is, I would hope that that's the critical question that you walk away thinking about after today. Eric, anything you want to add?
No.
Great. Okay. Moving forward. So reminder, Eric and I, as well as Liz, have been collaborating on the Pro Bono Net's Legal Empowerment and Technology Initiative. This is a project that we started working on with support from the Open Society Foundations. And our initiative's goal is to advance the strategy and practice of technology-enabled legal empowerment efforts. All of that is a little bit jargony, but like I mentioned before, today's session, less about the legal empowerment, a little bit more about the process of building the technologies that we've been working on. So for us, what that looked like was Pro Bono Net collaborated with Alaska Legal Services, Make the Road New York, and Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, as you can see on the screen, to build out 3 different technologies using co-design. So in Puerto Rico, we are building a foreclosure prevention tool that helps homeowners identify their risk of foreclosure. In Alaska, we are creating a disability benefits assister for case managers and community health aides that demystifies the Social Security disability application process. And in New York, we are developing a platform that worker organizers and paralegals can use to calculate and file wage theft claims. So 3 projects, all very ambitious in scope and all at varying levels of maturity. So in the process of building those 3 tools, we decided to apply a co-design approach or a participatory design approach to building those 3 tools. For those who may not be familiar, when it comes to building technology projects, a very common method that's used is called human-centered design. And in human-centered design, one of the key concepts is this idea of, instead of trying to guess or assume what a community or a target audience needs in order to improve a process or improve an experience, it's generally a better idea to get feedback from the community, have the community speak for themselves, or have a target audience give you feedback on an idea, an intervention, a project, so that that feedback informs the way your project is built. So this idea of embedding regular feedback loops into your product or program development process. This idea is quite common in from the technology world. What's different about our approach is traditional human-centered design gave us a very meaningful framework, but we did want to think about what it would look like to treat communities as not only partners in the thought process of building out a technology, but as leaders in the design process overall. So for us, there's a pretty key distinction there. To enable this community-led design effort, where community members are really defining the solution and defining the problem, we led virtual engagements that blended participatory action research methods with traditional design thinking in order to co-create the solutions we were imagining together. And as a result, all three tools that we built were built in partnership with not only legal aid attorneys as subject matter experts, which was important in our context, but really the end user themselves, which depending on the context could vary pretty widely. So with Eric, we worked closely with case managers who have experience working with disability benefits applications. And because I am neither a case manager, Eric is not a case manager, it makes a lot of sense to thoughtfully partner with case managers and learn from them what their needs are, rather than assuming we would know what their needs are, especially in the context of a technology solution. So ultimately, born out of this initiative were three tools that target community members who have experience navigating the law, but aren't necessarily lawyers themselves. That's part of the legal empowerment framework that we had in mind. And that's also a big part of why participatory / co-design was an important method for us. Cool.
Katie, could I, one follow-up, could I highlight for folks the distinction between human-centered and sort of community-led for those for whom that thing might have been. Would it be fair for me to summarize that based on, this is not from my knowledge, this is recycling Katie's knowledge, but would it be fair to summarize that by saying that traditional human-centered design is focused on the user of the thing, but the user is more or less a passive recipient. You're interested in how the user interacts with the thing and making sure they can get through it, but the user doesn't decide what the thing is about. You've already decided what the thing is about. You're talking about how the user is going to interact with it.
Yes, I would say that's generally true. And it makes sense given where human-centered design is born from, right? It's born from a business, corporate, Silicon Valley type context, which means if we want to apply a similar framework to a nonprofit context or a context where thinking about whatever, wherever community or whatever community means to you, you'll want to adjust that expectation accordingly. So I would agree, yes, Eric. The distinction is who is defining change, who has agency over who gets to define and in some cases implement that change. Cool. And Eric, anything else you want to share from this slide about the lessons you learned from implementing co-design as a first-time co-designer?
Yes. So I would say for us, this project we're undertaking is not only extremely complex, but it's of a nature of something that we haven't really ever done before in-house here at LS Legal Services. Designing a technology tool that is it's actually a product that someone would have and interact with. That's fundamentally different than a website or even a program, or so it's much. We don't have experience doing that, and we didn't have a method. Not having a method for how to approach that, my default would have been to find existing ones and try to adopt those, which would have been a more human design thing. So we were very fortunate to have Katie and Liz come and say, hey, there's another way you can do this. Let's try it this way, which was immensely beneficial. So because I didn't know what was happening, and put me on a model that was far more community responsive, and it's been immensely beneficial to the project. So I would say that the community design, I think, is particularly important for an organization who's doing something that's not only complex, but maybe of a type that your organization hasn't done before. And the importance, why I think that's so important, is because we have learned so much from having our users and community involved in the process. And having them central to that has helped keep the process itself and the design focused around that. Like we're, it feels more like we're orbiting what the community need is rather than just being out and checking in once in a while. And that makes the process itself more closely tied to what we need to be doing. It would be very easy to get lost in technical details and go down a rabbit hole talking about this stuff, and not keep our focus on what really is important. And as a nonprofit, that's what we should be doing, right? We think of ourselves as already doing that in our day-to-day work. That is what good community lawyering is. That's what good community development is. That's what they taught me when I was a Peace Corps volunteer. Well, you don't know what they need, go talk to them. And so having this as design philosophy is a way I think of, even if you're in strange waters, of keeping, it's your GPS, right? I know where I need to be. I know that this is what I'm working on. If that changes, I'm going to touch in with them. And that's been really very, very helpful to us. Another huge thing I've learned from that, which actually has applied to me more broadly than even just this project, is the importance of testing and feedback for the community. We're engaging with them and we're getting input from them, but how do we measure that? How do we know that? What's the practical tool for that? And one of the key parts of that is feedback and testing. Like, is this a good idea? Let's talk about it. Let's interview this person and find out. Does this thing work? Does it do what it needs to do? Well, we don't know if we don't test it, because we have to have someone actually from the community look at it and try it. In my experience in nonprofit projects, usually our ability to do a project is when we can get the internal stakeholders together to forget the other stuff that they're doing and focus on a thing. And then we do the thing and we all go off and do other stuff again. And that type of sustained follow-up and testing isn't sort of part of our culture. And that's really a shame, because it really should be. By definition, as an attorney for underprivileged folks, I am dealing with a undereducated, underinformed community. And it's my obligation as an attorney to explain it in terms that they understand. Right. And that obligation carries out into public facing stuff too. If I'm designing a thing that doesn't work for them, that doesn't help, right? And the only way I know is if I can go and test it. And so now I'm thinking, well, what about those forms we released? And what about the website? Like, we should be testing all of that, because we should. So that's a really important I want to think about as we go through, is that how do you know what the community wants and needs? Well, you have to ask them and talk to people and test stuff. Specifically, what I talk about coming up on is, we had a workshop which Katie facilitated, did a fantastic job with, which was, it was an occasion for us in our project to get together and force us to produce something and then test the thing, a very early prototype model. And some of the bits you'll see later on are from the initial stages of that, was sort of information gathering, designing, and then testing the thing we designed. And a few things from that just to think about, like if you're doing an exercise to do a co-design, you get people together, who you have in the room is really important. Shouldn't be a surprise, right? It's anytime you're trying to make an important decision happen, whether that decision is political or design-wise, you have to have the people in the room to make the decision. And one of the reasons that's particularly important here is the design process, whether you're using charts and slapping down sticky notes, whether you're combining things into a document electronically, right? You're going to be having some process, and you're going to be taking your folks through that process. But it's really important to remember that the process itself is of necessity artificial, right? It's not the process itself that elevates it to be community design. It's having the people in the room to make sure that the right opinions are weighted the right way, and that you have all the perspectives you need there, and that you have the decision makers. If you don't have the people, the process doesn't help. And finally, the facilitating part is so important, because to make sure that you're getting that down. What worked so well for us, and that we're able to do that all in a single week, was the process being able to, okay, we're gonna get these things out here, we're gonna look at them, we're gonna analyze them, we're gonna evaluate them, but ultimately our purpose there is to make decisions. It's a significant problem we have when we get a bunch of lawyers in a room, is that we like to talk about stuff, and we like to argue about stuff, and we like to wiffle waffle about stuff, and that doesn't get us anywhere. And one of the wonderful things about sort of this type of process is that we're going to make a decision. We're going to do the best we can. It probably isn't going to be perfect. We recognize that, and we can change it later. But for now, we need something to work on, so let's make a decision. And knowing you have the people in the room and you have a process to hear all those voices and get all that feedback is a way of feeling more comfortable with just choosing something and moving on. And lastly, out of that, one of the cool things about doing this electronically, and also can exist if you're doing it physically, you can take pictures of it and save them. But those process materials are really helpful later on. We might get a peek of it later, but like Katie has done this huge thing in Mural, an online thing. And so we can go back and see like what all of our brainstorm ideas were and how we weighted them and how we thought about that. And we've actually referenced that after the fact. Like, why did we think this way? Oh, that's right. Why didn't we? Oh, that's right. We always thought about that thing. And so having that type of documentation is really helpful for internal processes. It's really helpful for external. It's like, here's how we were thinking, here's how we talked about it. And it's, as opposed to just like, hey, we got together and talked about this and we didn't write anything down. It's immensely helpful. So I would encourage, when you're thinking about ways, how do we get together and think about it? Make sure you think of a way to keep it, because you're going to want it later. Katie?
Cool. Thanks, Eric. Yes, everyone will get a chance to actually see it's called a mural board. Folks who, we've all been working from home so much at this point that folks might already be familiar with these tools, but basically the workshop that Eric is referring to on this slide and that he just referred to very helpfully just now, that was a week-long series of workshops that I helped facilitate with Eric and the team to build our disability benefits assister. And that workshop was a great example, or that week-long series of workshops really was a great example that I'm going to jump into later of what it looks like trying to scale some of the exercise I could show. I actually want to take a moment, since there are more people in the room, and encourage folks to put some questions in the Q&A while I walk through the next exercise, because I'm curious if there's any specific questions coming up that could help me direct it. I'm really not sure, what familiarity with technology projects or design folks in the audience have right now. So I would be curious to get some gauge of that. Great, but in the meantime, I did want to walk us through one activity example. Like I mentioned before, this workshop is meant to encapsulate both examples of smaller, lightweight, easy ways to make what is otherwise somewhat endless remote online meetings a little bit more interesting, or ideally a little bit more participatory if you're trying to engage folks in something that requires a decision, right? Not just an icebreaker. So the map that folks have contributed to already on Google Slides, that I think is a great way to make a workshop of roughly this size, right? A little bit more interesting, a little bit more participatory. This is another example of a similarly, I'd say, sized exercise that can be applied to a variety of contexts. So the idea is called dot voting, and it's using some kind of icon to vote on an idea that you would like to see or to indicate your preference. Ideally, our team would have been able to use dot voting as a method in the workshops that Eric and I had just described, where in person, I would have given folks, stickers, like dot stickers, and been able to post photos, we would have been able to like physically put stickers onto whatever our preference is. And so to recreate that experience online, which is something I did have to do for one of our projects, this is an example of what that digital version looks like. So in this case, what we were working with was, this is a Google slide from a virtual co-design workshop that I facilitated with Angel Lopez, a designer, and we were working with organizers from Make the Road New York, based in New York City. And the organizers were calling in from various parts of the city, and we were using, I think, like Google Hangouts. And I was interested in understanding how the photos we intended to use, the visuals we intended to use in our tool that we were designing, I was interested in how those photos could truly reflect the lived realities of our tool's target audience. In this case, it was construction workers. So we were speaking to worker organizers whose jobs it is to work with the community, specifically construction workers. So as you can see, the red dots with the no sign in it, that reflects, those are the photos that folks from the workshop felt like didn't really reflect any kind of reality and wouldn't be very helpful. Whereas the photos with the green check marks on them are the ones that they felt like were more meaningful and more representative. And so that's an example of being able to use a more participatory process to enable a co-designed solution. In this case, we wound up going with photo number 3, which has the most green check marks on it. And the community organizers we spoke to were able to verbalize why that photo makes the most sense, tell us a little bit about their story, and that's the photo we went with. So that's a small example that I wanted to share that hopefully clarifies or illustrates a little bit of what this process looks like. Let me do a quick, any questions coming into the Q&A I should try to look at?
Liz posted one from sort of broader perspective, which good, we'll circle back around to that one. So nothing coming up yet. I'm keeping track.
Cool. Beautiful. Okay, so I was gonna have us open up the Google slide again and do a little mid-workshop round of dot voting. I wasn't sure, again, if folks were familiar with this concept, but I was gonna have folks dot vote. I'll give us a minute to dot vote for the dessert you would rather end a meal with. I realize that this slide is biased towards desserts I enjoy. So why don't folks take a second to hop into the Q&A or hop into the chat, pull up that Google slide again, and go ahead and drag the green checkbox over the dessert that you would prefer to have. We've got ice cream, chocolate chip cookie, or fruit. I know my mom would rather have me eat fruit, but you know, chocolate chip cookies and ice cream are not a bad deal either. Oh, someone went rogue and added a donut. Okay, okay. I see you, donut.
The donut pop-up actually reminds me that one of the ways which you'll see in the our procured mural chart, the items in our dot voting when we were talking about, essentially it was a distillation process, which we used our dot voting for. And the items we were dot voting on were actually things that we had brainstormed before. So like similar to the donut, right? If we had thrown out all the desserts we wanted and then, done a subset to categorize out and reduce that and then produce something that was votable. So that's exactly like the ability of someone to throw something on there with your group is really important. And that really helps, get the perspectives and get people on there. So if you're doing dot voting, right, as an exercise, if we hadn't had a format for the group to assemble and put things on there to get their input, then we really wouldn't have been doing community design, right? So thank you for posting the donut, because that's you'll see that reflected on the mural when we get there. But it goes to show, like, again, the process itself is not defending you against bias or giving you a good process, right? It's how you're using it and integrating into your folks you have.
Exactly. Thank you, Eric. Very true.
I read a lot into that donut, but
Don't we all? It is also occurring to me that choosing a photo of fruit with so many red fruits on it was probably not a great idea. So that is my bad. And I also want to shout out the plus sign for ice cream and chocolate chip cookie, because that is real too. And that is also a good example of things you might learn if you open up a process to be more participatory, which is, I had not thought of combining those on this slide, but is it an excellent idea? I would think yes. Okay, I think we have sufficiently learned what dot voting is and seen how that can work on this Google slide. Let me open it up again to the presentation. Great, okay. So going back to the community-centered perspective that Eric and I have been talking about, I wanted to share a few examples of activities that we used or that I have seen used in similar co-design types of environments. And I explicitly wanted to share ways, again, that you could scale those activities based on not only the size of the decision that you're trying to make, but also the degree of technology fluency that your audience might have. That was a really important consideration for myself and Eric and really every team I worked on, or every team I worked with for this project. Because the reality is there's a number of ways a community might not have access to technology the way that depending on where you're coming from, you might expect them to. In our case, I mentioned the photo example of dot voting where I used a Google slide. Using like Google Slides there was a little bit of there was definitely a little bit of risk in that choice. It did wind up working well, but even still, activities or tech tools that might be very commonly used in like white collar professional type of environments, may not be as helpful or as accessible for all. So that's just a consideration I wanted to call out and share a few ways to translate these kinds of activities that could, like Eric mentioned, activities that could support a co-design process, ways to translate those activities for both tech fluent and not as tech fluent audiences. So in the technology fluent column, I have tools that can support the activity on the left-hand side. So I'll go down the list. So with polling is a very useful way to get immediate feedback from your audience. And if I had more bandwidth, I would have loved to use polling in this session, but unfortunately didn't have it. No worries though. So inserting polls into a workshop is a great way to just get real-time feedback about what direction you're headed in and what your audience is looking for, right? Menti is the tool that I have seen used and found to be quite effective. But is probably a better fit for an audience that you'd expect would be more technology fluent. No worries though, if your audience is probably not going to have access to Menti, but they would be able to show up to a video call at least. Raising hands, good old fashioned raising hands, right? Trying to, as a facilitator, making sure that the video call software that you use enables you to see everyone you need to see, so that if someone raises their hand, you'd be able to see that, or your team would be able to see that. Another example, we just talked about dot voting. In this case, I used a Google slide, but folks have already called out, I think in the Q&A, Mural and Miro are also both great tools for online collaboration or online workshop activities, but they are probably better tools, again, for audiences that would feel comfortable navigating that kind of experience. Again, calling back the workshop that I mentioned before with the dot voting example, again, that workshop wound up working well, but a consideration I had to take was whether whether our audience members would know how to copy and paste that icon in the instruction, right? That was an instruction that for this group of people took like seconds to understand, but for the audience I was working with there, it took a little bit longer. And that's just, that's just something to keep in mind or pay attention to. If you are working with an audience that's not as tech fluent, it requires work in a different way, but asking folks to preparing like worksheets ahead of time and asking folks to print those out at home. I have seen that done before, and it is more manual and physically a little bit maybe cumbersome, but I have seen it work. It can be really effective, and it can actually even be a relief for audience members who, they don't want to have to learn a new interface, but they can certainly, in their case, print something out, put it on a wall, and then everyone's definitely looking at the same thing. They're just looking at the same thing in their own room. Sketching, asking folks to just draw what they have on mind, or using sketching as an activity, I have also seen and used and found to be effective. Again, tech fluent crowd, tools like Mural and Miro are great. AutoDraw is a tool I came across throughout this process and can also be, is also a creative way of engaging with an audience. But again, pen and paper never failed us, right? In the same workshop with dot voting, we also had folks in the workshop sketch a few of their ideas and then just either take a photo of the sketch and add it to the slide themselves. Or if you don't think your audience would feel comfortable with that, you can always just ask folks to, show the camera. Again, two different ways of scaling that activity up and down. And then the last activity, we didn't really incorporate this one, but it's borrowed from popular education. Using role play or skits is also a way of engaging with an audience that can translate fairly well, unfortunately, these days, because a lot of folks are familiar with video calling these days. Cool. Okay. And then a reminder, I know, let's see, we got about 20 minutes, perfect. A reminder that Eric had been emphasizing before, but I want to bring up again, is that these exercise ideas, these tools I've shared, interacting in this Google slide, all of these are meant to be examples or small demonstrations of how co-design activities can support a larger effort, right? So these tools are meant to be vehicles. They are not, by including them in your process, you are not necessarily making your process more participatory. You might just be doing whatever you normally do, and then you did a workshop, right? And that's depending on your context, it can be really tricky to figure out what the difference actually looks like, especially if you don't normally think about co-design or think about participatory work in this way, or if your organization isn't structured to function this way, this can be really challenging. Which is why I wanted to share some of those smaller examples first as a way to test the waters or just explore what co-design looks like in your context. But I do want to remind us that really these tools are meant to enable greater participation and agency between stakeholders of a project, but the tool themselves are not a silver bullet, unfortunately. So I would hope that folks can saw examples of these activities and exercises and can think about how to strategically organize them or implement them in your own context, or layer them in a way that can enable more intentional decision making. So using these activities don't necessarily make your work more participatory or your end goals more equitable. That's something to keep in mind. And like Eric said before, a lot of the success of these activities really comes out of the preparation that came before them and digesting what comes out of them. So that's true for this workshop as well. I would hope that
good facilitation, in other words. Right? As highlighted by Jim in chat with the resource link there, but there's no, you still have to understand the power dynamics of the room and what the decision makers are, and what the cultural contexts are, and make sure you are comfortable, make sure you understand what they're doing, make sure they have your trust as facilitator, which I would say that in the session that Katie ran for us, it was always very clear that what are we doing now? What is this thing? What is this for? How does this fit into the process? And developing that sort of trust with the people there allows everybody to put their stuff out there. And once you've got past the icebreaker stage, you get to that where the good stuff happens.
Yes, exactly. Cool. Okay, let me take a second, to jump out of the Google slide again. Actually, while I'm doing that, what's going on in our, what is that, an espresso? I honestly don't know what that is, but it looks really tasty. Cool, okay. Someone said no to the donut. I'm gonna jump into a virtual whiteboard that Eric, myself, and teammates from Alaska Legal Services used to co-design a prototype for the disability benefits tool that I mentioned. So I'm going to walk us through this, and then we'll jump into some Q&A. For those who don't know, the purpose of a tool like Mural, which is what we're looking at, is to simulate what would happen in real life if myself, Eric, all of us on this call could meet up physically in a room and use a whole bunch of sticky notes or whiteboards to collaborate together, brainstorm, think of ways to solve whatever problem we're interested in together. So this whole, scrolling out, this whole page that we're looking at is meant to replicate the literal whiteboard that we would have used. And these little colorful blocks, those are meant to be the sticky notes we would have written together. I am going to walk through this, but please say something in the chat if I am moving around too much, because I know that can be really unpleasant. Cool. Okay. So starting from a very high level, you might be able to see that there are all these different sections broken out on this page. And each of these sections represented some kind of exercise, right? So we just did a couple of exercises together. We did that map, and then we did the dot voting. If you wanted to scale some kind of participatory or co-design experience, using, and if you were stuck in a virtual environment, using something like Mural and using something like this whiteboard can be really effective. Of course, there are considerations that have to be made if you're working with a less technology fluent community. In that case, it's worth questioning, is technology even really the right intervention or answer in that context? But in our case, this was a good fit. So what you're looking at from left to right, and then as we move down the page, is basically the evolution of our collective decision-making and brainstorming process. Moving through this entire page took 5 days. No, it took 1 day. It took one day. It was 1 day of co-design, and then we did a whole bunch of other work. But this was 1 day where Eric, myself, and other really key stakeholders on this project were able to set aside like almost 8 straight hours together of just figuring out what we wanted, what the guardrails around this project should look like. We interviewed and did some research with case managers. It was really like a big, intense huddle for a full day. So that is on a high level what we're looking at. And then I'm not going to go through every single exercise since we're low on time.
Could you just highlight quickly, because I think relevant, which parts a lot of us you had prepared before that, and then had us engage with it as we went along and sort of dragged us around. Could you just highlight what was original and what was from the session?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to scroll in. I'm really sorry if this is making anyone dizzy. Just heads up. So this would be an example of some work we had done beforehand to prepare for this engagement, this virtual co-design engagement. So this is a journey map for those who might not be familiar with this design process, where basically we mapped out the life of a disability benefits application. What needs to happen from the perspective of different users as they move through the process of applying for disability benefits in Alaska. I had prepared this beforehand with a lot of help from Eric. And then on our co-design day, we were able to use this map to make decisions about the scope of what the tool could look like, and brainstorm more ideas about the tool, as well as identify at what stage in this process would we want the tool to target. What stage in this process would our potential users be interested in seeing an intervention in as well. Great. I'll do one more example and then skip to questions. But here's an example of another activity where, sorry, scrolling in, I'm really sorry. This is another example of an activity where folks in the room were able to write out their ideas or their responses to some prompts that I shared. And then we were able to collectively dot vote on those ideas together. So you'll see on the right-hand side, sorry, the lag. You can see that these big red dots represent the ideas that we ultimately landed on. And then after we landed on these specific ideas, we moved through the rest of the board and thought about ways to flesh out what those ideas would mean in the context of our project. Okay, I'm gonna stop moving around because I am nervous about folks.
And the lag, by the way, is one of the reasons that you were skeptical. Well, the reason we are using Mural today, for example, is we had a significant problem with lag, even with the 12 users we had in Mural, which you found frustrating, right?
Yes, this is true. It's, virtual engagement is possible, but it does not come without its own challenges.
Yeah.
So something to
having
consider.
Alaska users doesn't help.
Yes, I was calling from New York, and Eric is in Alaska, if we didn't make that clear. Great. Okay, that's pretty much everything I had for today. Why don't we jump into questions folks have? Oh, and thank you so much for listening.
So, Katie, this wasn't asked explicitly, but it's one that we get a lot, and it connects to the point that Eric made early on, that it's not the process or tools itself that makes it community design. It's having the right people and voices in the room. And I wondered if either of you could talk a little bit more about how you find and engage those voices, and if there's any practices that either of you have used around compensating people for their time or supporting them for their time. Any recommendations around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Eric, do you want to?
Sure, I'll start. This is it's sort of in the division of roles of project. Katie is like sort of technical area expert, and we at Alaska Legal Services sort of the on the ground folks with the problem. It was essentially on us as the the local partner to be like, okay, who's who we need, because ultimately it's our project, so we have to know who's going to be using it, who are our stakeholders in using it, who is going to be our audience for it, what programmatical partners do we have involved. So essentially the work of getting the people in the room was largely based on our perception at Legal Services of who already is in the scope of this problem locally, who is in this particular case, because I'm a disability attorney, I've worked with a lot of local case managers, and I know the other agencies who do disability appeals locally. So I had a network to pull from. And then we also had a network to pull from the Alaska Native Health System in Alaska, where we have embedded attorneys in a number of places, and a close working relationship. So we were essentially calling upon those resources and connections that we already had to be able to put those together and get the people we needed. So ultimately, that's more of a traditional problem-solving thing. Sorry, food delivery. My son delivers my food. It's a perk of working from home. The solution to that problem isn't any different than any other nonprofit problem solving. Ultimately, that's a best practice thing for the project, any project development itself. The hinge here is how to get them into the room and help them be useful and helpful. And a significant part of that, as you mentioned, for folks who like just can't take the time to come, and if you don't want to be cutting off that group of folks to get that participation, one trick we used was as something that was really quite normal for testers in a testing setting, is to say, hey, look, here's we can compensate you for your time. Here's a gift card or just something to say, hey, like, we value your time, we value your input, and we want to make it more able for you to come.
Thanks, Eric. To add to that, especially from a broader project context, so not just the Alaskan project that Eric and I have been talking about, but also in reference to the work that we did with Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico and also Make the Road New York. This is an area where the distinction between traditional software development or technology project development and the kind of co-designing we were trying to do with technology, this is where that distinction really shows up, or can really show up. So in traditional human-centered design or traditional technology project development, if you are interested in getting feedback from users or your audience, it can still be, it's usually better to try and pay the folks you're trying to get feedback from, because they're more likely to be, they're literally incentivized to give you feedback, right? But in that model, thinking of users as folks you're paying for their comments about, doesn't necessarily address equity or differences in power that need to be thought through in a community-led context. So in a community-led context, if the way you are engaging your context, your community in your context is to ask for feedback, like it's literally just either an interview or someone fills out a survey. In our case, it was a lot of qualitative interviews. Certainly compensation is a useful vehicle for saying, we value your time. And also in some cases, the stories that someone shares, the feedback that they give, is a kind of labor. It is a kind of work that they're doing. And it's worth being paid fairly to do that work. Yes, so that's one way, like thinking about that exchange, if it is that type of back and forth, from a compensation perspective, that is an area that's worth thinking about and trying to be thoughtful about. Other questions?
A question, Katie, that came up about being an effective facilitator. Do you have any resources you suggest that you've learned or to top up or refresh your facilitation skills? Where did you learn to do it? And do you have any more programmatic ways where you can resources or training systems to help people build that capacity? Because clearly you can't be doing this without having people who can do that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm very intrigued by the suggestion that one of the folks in the chat made. So I'd point folks to that if you're interested. For me, I learned a lot about facilitation just from trying to become a better listener. I think that's like a core skill that is a useful one to think about and invest in. But more practically, I would recommend looking for participatory action research facilitation guides online, because I really think that literally that combination of keywords will get you the kind of resources you might be interested in looking at. There are also some blog posts I have written that talk about how to facilitate work online that might be helpful as well.
Great. Well, I think we are just about out of time, so I think we'll pause there. But Katie or Eric, anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so, but I hope this was helpful, and I'm happy to talk more about any of these ideas in our Slack.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. And thank you everybody here for joining us. As Katie said, she has drafted some really thoughtful articles that reflect on her experience designing and moderating these workshops and interviewing and bringing in folks like Eric who helped facilitate them as well. So those have been shared through Slack, the event Slack channel, and we will make sure they get linked from the Decolonizing Justice resource page as well. But really appreciate everybody joining us this afternoon. And please do rejoin us tomorrow for our second to last session, Envisioning a Just Future for All, Nurturing and Sustaining Justice Movements, which just has a terrific lineup of leading activists and movement lawyers who will reflect on the work that many in this community are doing now and would like to build on in the future. So thank you. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.